teach out. I'm going to try to talk about the Gilets jaunes movement in France, which started on 17th November 2018, and which is, as you probably don't see in the media in the UK, but it's still lasting right now. So the idea is that France, as you might know, is a country where you have quite often social movements, strikes, which are quite often union-based, they're left-wing, or they're more on the autonomous side, such as the ZAD of Notre-Dame-des-Landes. And the Gilets jaunes is a movement which did not stem from, the usual, let's say, social movements in France, by its sociological composition, by the way it organized, by its political aspects, and also by the way it threatened the French state and by the way the French state responded. So I'm going to try to have a little chronology, talking about the political aspects of that movement, the place of the far right as well. And I'm going to try to keep the presentation not too long, as you might have already seen a few presentations of the teach out. So, and feel free to interrupt, feel free to ask questions, comment if you don't agree, etc. So, the Gilets jaunes movement, as I said, started officially on the 17th of November 2018, but actually, and this is the first aspect which is really interesting about this movement, at the summer of 2018 started a campaign on social media with groups called La France en colère, which is Angry France, of people being unhappy about basically anything, like taxes, the government, but not like framing this either in a far right way or in a left wing way, but just people being unhappy about these taxes, and especially gasoline taxes, as it's probably not the case here, but in France, the public, the state tried to have people running on diesel cars, which was has a good fiscality, so you didn't pay much tax if you were riding diesel. And when Emmanuel Macron came to power, they started, in the name of ecology, they started to raise the price of the diesel engines. So basically, all the people and poor people who'd been buying diesel cars were now finding their oil to be getting more and more expensive. And strangely, as there have been quite lots of neoliberal reforms, this is what fueled at first the discontent of this movement. And after the creation of these groups, you also had people on social media who became a bit like influencers, shooting videos of themselves being unhappy about the situation, being unhappy about the taxes, the corruption of elected officials, and being quite massive. And one of them said, if you're okay with that, put a yellow vest, because in French car you have to have a yellow vest in the car instead of an emergency. Put the yellow vest on your dashboard and drive with that. So, to be honest, I thought it was quite ridiculous at first.
Wait, you put the yellow vest on the dashboard?
Yeah, your yellow vest is on the glove box, normally, on the glove compartment. And the idea was to show that your yellow vest was visible by having it on the dashboard. Right. So when you were driving, you could see that people had a yellow vest. And the 2 weeks before the 17th of November, quite surprisingly, it was like when I was driving, and pretty much you had like one car out of two with the yellow vest. And you had calls for a massive day, not of demonstrations, but of blockades on the 17th of November. So that was the actual start of the Gilets jaunes. And what was very surprising is that people actually turned out massively. There were, I think, 500,000 people according to the French state, French Ministry of Interior. Probably, 3 or 4 times more as the state was counting, and no one else was establishing other ways of counting. And what people did was not to demonstrate. There were quite a few demonstrations, but actually to gather on roundabouts, and they started occupying and blocking the roads. and which was something that surprised everyone. I think it surprised the people who actually came out, because what was very interesting is that most of the people who came to roundabouts on the first day didn't know anyone. They hadn't like gathered before, and people just turned up with yellow vests. And how you said, there was a process of what you would call, if you take social movement theory, of milling, an emerging norm, I would say. And so this is when it started. And what was very surprising is that people actually did not, after the first day, they did not go home. They stayed, they spent the night on the roundabouts, they spent the night on the blockades. And you had, on the Sunday, you had 30,000 people on the streets blocking every road, according to the government, probably more. And it kept on going like this. So the chronology of the movement is, this, is divided in acts, which are like strong times, which are every Saturdays, because it's not a union movement, so people are not striking. So people actually gather and have the strong times on Saturdays, where there are less people working. So, and we can see three main periods of the movement. So the main period is what we call the growth, from Act, let's say, 1 to 4, for 1 month, when much of France was paralyzed, and also, quite quickly, lots of violence scuffles between the protesters and the police emerged, and bringing pretty much France to a standstill. And on Act 3, challenging the capacity of the French state to maintain order. Well, we'll come back to that a little later. And which ended with massive repression since Act 4, which is the 8th December of 2018, with 9,000 rounds of rubber bullet guns being fired at the crowd on that day, so which is a lot. And still massive rioting. And at the same time, an emergency package of measures, which was the increase of, how do you call that, minimum wage by 100 euros a month, measure for poor pensioners, old, I don't know what to call that, retraités, old people or on pensioners. Well, several measures, the scrapping of the gas tax, which are supposed to increase, the scrapping of the increase of the price of electricity, which kind of quiet down the movement. Then there's what I would call the plateau. It's between, let's say, for 3 months and a half, from, let's say, half of December to half of March, until Act 18, every Saturday, even though the blockades were not as strong, they were still remaining. Every Saturday, you'd have massive rioting in most major French cities, with very strong points of the movement being Bordeaux, Toulouse, and Montpellier, but in smaller cities such as Dijon, Strasbourg, Nancy, Épinal, you still have massive rioting as well, with, according to the state, between 30 to 60,000 people mobilized. And on the 18th of March 2019, there was the last of these acts, where there was, how you say, massive rioting in Paris and the Champs-Élysées being ransacked again, which are images you might have seen as well on television. And then the third period, which would be the fading away, which is still lasting now, is having much smaller numbers, but still a residual presence in roundabouts and occupation points, still demonstrations numbering to the thousands, national demonstrations, and with still scuffles with the police. And the hot points of the movement still, let's, for instance, in Toulouse, there will be between 1,000 and 2,000 persons every Saturday still demonstrating, and still a lot of tear gas as well. So that's, I say, that would be the chronology. So what's interesting also to understand the movement is trying to understand it through its claims. So this is one, you can see one image of the 10 biggest claims of the Gilets jaunes. And basically, you can categorize the claims into 5 categories. The first are the original claims, which are related to driving, because also it's I think it's part of important part of everyday life of workers who live in the periphery. In France, I don't know it works in Great Britain, it's probably the same. Is people have to drive to go everywhere if you live around cities, to go to work, to go to the groceries, etc. So if you have, how you say, precarious income, low income, how you say, gas will impact quite strongly that. So there was the claims relating to driving, which was the price of gas, but also speeding tickets, etc., which was originally what the movement came from, which was originally also, when you try to analyze it, you're thinking this might be a right-wing movement. The second kind of claim, which evolved, came a little later, was claims against the government, against the corruption, alleged corruption of elected officials, and against the president, which is Macron, very strong hate of the president as well. And what came after a couple of weeks in the movement is from the claims relating to driving and to expensive life. Some social claims were, what I would call social claims, were formulated, which would be the augmentation of living wage, of pensions for the people who are retired, the fact of public service in rural areas are being shut down in France as part of an austerity economy drive, the revival of that public service as well as the public hospital, and also social justice, because there's one controversial tax which is called ESF, is tax on fortune, which was scrapped by the Macron government, and people were asking also that to be brought back, because it should, well, people saying the crisis should be paid also by the rich, not only by the poor people. A fourth kind of claim, which came later on in the movement after the anti-emergency package was adopted by Macron, was calls for direct democracy, which is against representative democracy and elected officials, what you would call RIC, referendum of citizens' initiatives, basically that anyone could, you say, not agreeing to a law or a social measure could be, as how you say, if so many citizens would sign it, could call for a referendum. So that's at the same time a claim for direct democracy, but also came from someone called Etienne Chouard, which is, how you say, a Confucianist. Someone that's at the same time working with the far right, but also claiming to be far left. So there was some ambivalence towards that revendication, but it seems within the Gilets jaunes to have gone further than just agreeing with Chouard's ideology, but more of a claim for direct democracy, and which came later in the month of January, February, was claims specific towards state violence as repression was increasing, which was against the weapons used by the French police, because you have rubber bullet guns, but you also have explosive grenades, which hold TNT, and you had several persons losing their hands to these grenades, or people being severely injured. Lots of people were imprisoned. I think over 1,000 people were sentenced to jail over the movement, which is a lot for a social movement. And also justice for people who were wounded by the police. There were a march of the wounded people, because 25 people were blinded of one eye. You got 5 hands were torn off. There's a woman called Zineb who was killed by in Marseille, who was killed in Marseille by a tear gas grenade. She was shot in the head by that tear gas grenade as well. So there was calls for justice and trials for the police, because there has been almost no trials after a year and a half of movement. There's only 2 trials of police officers, which are throwing stones at people with no protection during the demonstrations. So there's the claims. An interesting thing is to talk about the sociological composition. Well, I'm sorry I didn't have the time to translate that. So basically, what I would say is the social composition from early sociological works would be very different from classical social movements in France, as people would be less economically integrated, and people are, something called the épice precariousness in this, which is something you really do not care as French politics, but people were scoring very high on that index, on precariousness and being casual worker. And also, the profile would be people living on the periphery of cities, poor working class with not integrated, a lot of people with, how you say, casual contracts. And that's interesting because it can also bring to Piven and Cloward's theorization of poor people's movements, which according to the theoricists have a bigger tendency to have direct action, more violence, but also no representation, a refusal of representation of leaders, which is something that occurred in the Gilets jaunes movement. What's interesting also to see is that the political composition of the movement, there were some surveys to see who the people being active in the Gilets jaunes were voting for. And the first studies to be taken with gloves, because it's the representation and things have evolved at times of the movement, but the first studies in the beginning said that a fourth of the people participating voted for the left wing. Half of them had stopped voting and were abstentionists, so it's quite interesting as well, and 1/4 for the far right, so also something to be taken into account. Talking about political parties that were present and political forces, the far right at the start of the movement was quite present. You had a party called Debout la France, which is a sovereignist, let's say something that might be close to the Brexit party here. Rassemblement National, National Front, Marine Le Pen, which you probably have heard about. And you also had a force called the Bastion Social, which is a neo-fascist movement. Neo-fascist hooligan street violence movement, which was present in the beginning. And the left did not come around at first. The left was quite skeptical of that movement because it was based on tax, and being against taxes in France is historically more a right-wing thing. And after, let's say, the first period, after the first 2 weeks, the left began to invest the movement massively. So you had anarchist organization, you had the invisible committee groups, which were also parts of the scuffles and the riots. France Insoumise, which is the left, more, I don't know if far left is a good term, but yeah, left. Also unions. Most of the unions did not come into the movement except for one union called Solidaire, which quite early invested the movement. And so it's a political composition which was quite odd because there's something you could not find in every social movement, as you'd have basically people uniting around the symbol, around practices, about the fact of occupating, but no ideological or political homogeneity. So I would say that's how also we can talk about the emerging norm theory about that, the Killian, and which is quite. This is an image I like because it shows the lack of homogeneity of the movement. You have a national flag, which is in France more of a nationalist symbol, with an A of anarchy, and with power to the people written there. So it shows also the, how do you say, the
broad church.
Yeah. And it's really funny also because at some point the practice of the black bloc became much more important within the movement, and the fact of being in the black bloc before was supposed to be more of an anarchist thing. And basically lots of the Gilets jaunes participated to the black bloc, but without the anarchist ideology. So you had, like, on social media, you had power to the black bloc with French flags, which was also something you didn't see usually. So that was interesting regarding the political composition. Also, which was interesting, and which was an evolution, lots of left activists were happy to see, is that the far right actually was part of the movement. He was never gained hegemony through the movement, but the far right with national rally activists, but also fascist activists, tried to be part of the movement. They tried to impose their claims, especially around the Pact of Marrakesh. I don't know if you heard about that, but it was supposed to be a pact that would open France to immigration, and he tried to push that very strongly on social media. And after a few weeks, it actually was kind of a failure for the far right, who kind of like stopped supporting it, especially for the national rally. And there were, I think, 3 reasons to that. Is that when the movement turned to social claims, let's say the increase of minimum wage, most of the far right activists are not in favor of the increase of minimum wage. It's not what they're about. And also when the police repression became very strong, basically the whole of the movement, which at start was the Gilets jaunes, were non-violent and pro-police. Everyone was like, we love the police with us, and trying to collaborate on with the blockades. And as there was strong repression, people's ideas regarding that changed very, very quickly, as people had actually seeing a demonstration being repressed on TV is not the same thing as being tear gassed in lively or having your friends being shot by rubber bullet guns. And you had videos who became viral also on social media of repression, and that turned the movement, which basically, let's say for instance in classical social movement, there's not such a support for the use of violent means in France, even though some parts of the movement use it. But with the Gilets jaunes, even though most of the movement remained non-violent, there was never any, very quickly there was no condemnation and no separation between people who were using violent means and people who were not. And this is also something which, as the far right claims to be more of an order, at least the French far right claims to be more of an order, pro-order, taking a pro-order stance. That was something that was a problem for them. And last but not least, as the left entered the movement, there were scuffles in most French major cities between the far-right activists and anti-fascist activists. And surprisingly, as the far-right is supposed to be good on street violence, they lost in every city, even in Lyon, where the French far-right, French fascist groups are really extremely strong. But there was a pitched street battle, which you can see here, between the anti-fascists and the Zouaves and the Bastion Social groups, which actually the far right lost. And after that, there was kind of the turning point regarding the presence of the far right within the movement, as they could not even maintain their presence in their stronghold, which was Lyon, basically, and they kind of faded out after that. So another thing interesting to talk about is the repertoire of actions, the different actions that were undertaken. The first and foremost part of the action of the Gilets jaunes was occupation, which were semi-permanent settlements on roundabouts and pay tolls, and which was how people actually structured. It means you're taking part of the Gilets jaunes, you're going to a roundabout, which was where you met the people when you organized local protests, petitioning, etc. And people kind of, at the same time as having like social movement activity, also developed a communal, let's say, interaction and life also, which was something that was quite important, especially in those areas where people are quite atomized and there are not that many social relations. And that made also that you had, let's say, 2,000, 3,000 polycentric centers, which are the basic cells of the movement, but which failed to coordinate in an effective way, which never did actually, even though there were some attempts to that, but they never became representative. The second repertoire of action was the blockade, blocking roads, trying to do economic blockade, so blocking, for instance, in France, the highway between France and Spain, blocking petrol refineries, petrol factories, blocking distributing centers of goods. So, and for sometimes the shelves in supermarkets were quite empty because of these blockades as well. There was also a big part of the movement which was sabotage. Sabotage was mainly on automated radars. Probably not something you don't say in the UK, but it's automatic speeding ticket machines, which drive people very angry, and as driver also understand that. And people starting at first covering them and then burning them. And I say after 3 weeks of the movement, maybe 3,000 of them have been destroyed. So the sabotage element was quite important, and as they're being put back up, they're being destroyed again as well. And in some cases, pay tolls, like highway pay tolls, which are the same thing, as supposed to, were seen by people basically as hindering their revenues, as they have to pay the tolls to go to work, etc. In some cases have been either destroyed or even burned to the ground. And which actually came later, after 1 or 2 weeks of the movement, the demonstration. The demonstration basically was, I say, the symbol, the vitrine. The symbol of the movement. You had the movement going on the whole week, and you had one demonstration on the Saturday. Then you had massive demonstrations in Paris, which were, I say, a stage of massive scuffles and also highly mediatized. And after the second period, the rest of the repertory action, the occupation, the blockades, they kind of died down, or they went down as the police also cleared the occupations, and they systematically cleared and attacked the occupations, which they did not at first. And the demonstration became more central, and nowadays you have mainly demonstrations still going on. Sorry, I didn't translate that again. So what's interesting regarding social, sorry, this is the wrong image as well. In social movement theories, that it's the fading of the difference between the left and the right, which also allows the emergence of the Gilets jaunes, who have social claims which could be linked to the left, but they're not claiming to be part of the left or wanting to be taking part to the left. That's one thing. Another thing which is very interesting is that the repertoire of action is something that in France could be found in the anarchist autonomous movement. For instance, was occupying the ZAD in Brittany, which was occupying, blockading, but also using tactics such as scuffles with the police. And these actions are being used by the Gilets jaunes, but without the ideology that would go with them in the anarchist autonomous movement. So that's also quite interesting. And I think not having the ideology also allowed much broader appeal and possibility for the people to join the movement also. And the third interesting point is a horizontal organization. So it's the refusal of a social movement organization, which means that lots of people actually try to organize the Gilets jaunes, but every attempt to organize and structure the Gilets jaunes was met by failure, as the other centers of roundabouts, assemblies, would not be wanting to recognize the authority or the structuration of the other ones. And so organization through social media was quite important, but the influential figures who arose from the social media never managed to be more than influencers, to become actual leaders of an influence to the movement. It's quite interesting because in demonstrations, I went to a couple of demonstrations where they actually were there, Eric Drouet, Maxime Nicole, and leaders of a movement would have been inside of the demonstration, let's say leading the people, etc. And these influential figures would be like, on the side of a demonstration with like friends of them guarding them, but never inside of a demonstration. They'll be more as commenters. People were putting comments and describing, than actually engaging actively inside of the demonstration. So that's also interesting. And lastly, I will talk about repression as very quickly, there's a scope of violence from the demonstrators. The intensity was not great. Mostly like the right and the scuffle, you had people throwing stones, and organized violence, like let's say organized cocktail molotovs or using of bolt throwers, I don't know how you call that, were something that was very seldom seen, so people were not organized in fighting the police. But there were numerous amounts of people actually taking part of that. And it's probably pretty much the widest scope of violence on the streets since May 68 in France. And in December 1st, 2018, there was the climax of that, with massive rioting everywhere in France, on the French territory. Basically, maybe you had, let's say, 100 and 200 towns where you had riots. You had exceptional destructions in Paris, where actually, after shooting 16,000 tear gas grenades, the police lost control of the Rive Gauche, the left bank of Paris, which was like where the richest part of Paris, basically, and there was massive looting, massive destruction there. But you also had places such as Narbonne, which is in southern France, where people destroyed the Paytol using a crane to bring a burning car to the Paytol. And after that, they burned down the police station neighboring the Paytol. You also have Le Puy-en-Velay, which is a town of 24,000 inhabitants in the center of France, where they destroyed the prefecture, which is where the state representation of the states is being there. So you also have in Ardèche, which is same thing, a rural department. There was a commune of 2,000 people, which saw a 12-hour riot of people gathered there. So quite exceptional as well. And as the scope, not the intensity of the violence, was exceptional, the state violence was also exceptional, and I was normally having a half an hour presentation about that, which I will not make because it will take too much time. But basically, normally in France, you've got riot police. You got two corps of riot police, which is the Gendarmerie Mobile and the CRS, which are 25,000 police officers, which are specially trained for crowd control. But in that case, it was not the riot police as much were used as other units, which are called urban violence units, which are CDI and BAC. And BAC is plainclothes officers. And there was use basically of exceptional violence and widespread, basically the police would quite often attack demonstrators even though they were not being violent at all, just to disperse the crowds. And using weapons, as I told you, explosive grenades and especially LBD, which is rubber bullet guns, which injured lots of people with on the 8th of December, as already said, 9,000 rounds being shot in one day, which was more than what the French police used in 8 years before that, which is including major social movements. And the use of the BAC, which is those units, which are plainclothes police officers wearing hood, being masked, and basically being the most brutal officers. And this is one slide about, you had the human rights observers, basically, which were trying to film and document the state violence. And they were quite often victims of violence and abuse. And this is a BAC officer with a rubber bullet gun with the laser aiming at the observer, so stating it's an observer, at the back of the head, just to intimidate the observer. So this is also an instance of BAC officers in Toulouse. These images were taken in Toulouse. This is a Punisher mask. I don't know if you heard of that comic book figure, but it's pretty much a vigilante executioner. So you have a police officer in plain clothes wearing a vigilante mask, which is also quite symbolic. And this is a video which, you don't speak French, but it's very funny. It's in Montpellier. It's not very funny, but it's the head of actually the anti-criminal brigade of Montpellier wearing a hood, which is threatening an observer, which is a Human Rights League observer, calling her a dirty anarchist against democracy and saying, you're against democracy, we're going to kill you, etc. So, and this is the French police. So this is to show you the scope of what violence was faced as well. And this is also the back, as you can see it on the streets and the French demonstrations now. So quite a lot of LBD, which is a modified grenade launcher that shoots soft, about this of rubber and this of hard plastic, and they're quite hurtful. And basically the tactic at some point, they turn around in March, but for 3 months, basically it doesn't happen anymore, but it happened, and I witnessed it actually. They were shooting people, not people who were fighting with the police, but there was a strategy of shooting people randomly within the crowd. And this person is, it's called Alex, and I was there observing a demonstration, and I witnessed that. Actually, there was quite strong fighting between the head of the demonstration and the police, and they were on a slope. And so basically the Gilets jaunes, they had banners, which were armored banners. So basically they're armored and reinforced, so the police could not shoot at them with to have a shield from the rubber bullet guns. So basically it was kind of a stalemate, and what happened is that back units such as these, they could not hit the people who were in the first ranks because they were shielded by the banners. But you had people on the ranks that were much further, which were not actually throwing anything on the police. And I was not far from this person who was shot between his 2 eyes by a rubber bullet gun, as he was just being there and not being part of the riot or the scuffles. And actually his skull was fractured, so he had to go through surgery. He had a head trauma. Luckily he recovered quite fully, but still this is an example of injuries. As you have very many injuries, you had people who were blinded, people who lost their hands as well. And it's only one part of the exceptional repression that struck the movement, where there's also judicial repression with lots of people being put to jail. And I would call that, rather than regular policing or crowd policing, counter-insurrectional crowd policing. And that's also something that you can see when, let's say the French state was challenged. It used violence, which was contradictory to the laws that organized policing in France. And such tactics seems to have been used in Chile as well during the recent social movements, which I think you could draw a parallel between the movements in Chile and the Gilets jaunes movement. And also the movements in Catalonia, which are more of it's not nationalist, but autonomous protest, but you also have massive use of rubber bullet guns. So the Gilets jaunes movements were also, I think, a laboratory for counter-insurrectional policing on part of the French police, which also is, I think, is circulating broadly around the world. And yeah, well, that's about it. Just want to say it's a movement that brought about lots of changes in social movements in France, that inspired also the pension strikes, which are still going on in France. We don't know yet what the outcome will be, but it was, I think, it's a complete renewal of the nature of social movements in France so far. And even though now the movement is residual, but it's quite exceptional that a movement started in 2018 might still be going on in 2020. It's quite unusual as well. And that's about it. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. I wanted to, I'm French as well.
Okay.
And I've been observing all this from the UK and from like accounts from family and friends. I think one thing that I find really, really worrying is to look at that practice of police violence, of riots, because obviously the police has always been violent towards certain areas in Paris, towards certain populations, people of colour, but they've kind of turned towards being violent, towards just general people who hadn't experienced that violence before. And I have memories of the kind of first demonstrations where we saw police in riot gear coming in a systematic way to demonstrations, which they hadn't really before. And then from that use, that is, I think, still ongoing now in demonstrations against the pension dispute. I think what I find really, really worrying is that in France, demonstrating is, especially if you're in a left-wing house, is part of your political kind of consciousness awakening. I've got memories of being brought, as an 8-year-old kid to my first demo by my mom, who was like, here, hold this. We're protesting this dirty prefect who's racist. And in France, the first May protests, especially, are really, really important as a kind of yearly big demo in all big cities. And now you've got so many people, whether they're disabled or of a certain age or with children, who now think twice about going on protests because they're really, really worried about being hurt themselves or having kids being hurt. And it's quite obviously a huge tactic by the government to not just repress violence, but to repress people's ability to just do something that I think is quite important in French culture, especially for certain people. But so I don't know if you've been to more recent protests in the last year. I know there's been loads of violence still going on. Do you find that's transferred from the Yellow Vest movement to the pension dispute? Is there the kind of same level of engagement between police and...
But there's a slight difference between the pensions, is that the pensions, during the pension strikes, during demonstrations, you've got, in the Gilets jaunes, you've got, let's say, one crowd. You've got the one part of, I don't think there's an English equivalent to that, but the word is cortège, is a part of a demonstration which is led by an organization, a movement. Whereas in the pension movements, you've got let's say the CGT, which is the main union cortège. And you have something called the cortège de tête, is where people want to, let's say, be wild, but not necessarily violent, engage, and come. And actually, there's pretty much the same policing, but only towards the cortège de tête, not regarding the rest of the, let's say, the CGT. The French police has attacked the CGT very rarely, as its union is also has much more legitimacy in media, etc. And actually, during the pension movement in December, which was quite surprising for me, is that you had less violence than during the Gilets jaunes, but you actually had much more mediatic coverage of that violence, and it was even less legitimate. And you had images which were all around the world of the police just charging people and hitting them with batons, which is something we would see, I've seen at every demonstration of the Gilets jaunes. And these images were actually on the TV, whereas in the Gilets jaunes, I did like an observation of police practice on 20 demonstrations last year on the Gilets jaunes. And you could be kept an hour in a kettle and being tear gassed, which is pretty much torture. And no one would ever speak about that. And with the unions, which is a different kind of movement, more integrated as well, there's more visibility to that violence, I guess. And and just regarding what you were saying, I think the violence that you see on the demonstration comes from what the violence of the police were in the banlieue neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And this specific police practice, which is called not maintien de l'ordre, which is crowd control, but violence urbaine, which is seeing every person who demonstrates not as a person exerting a democratic right, but as a criminal. And I would say the banlieues were the laboratory for this crowd control in the Gilets jaunes as well.
I just wanted to ask a question, because before you gave this presentation, which I think was fantastic, my view on the Yellow Vest movement was actually quite negative, because I saw the people in this country who were following it. And I just wanted to ask the question about whether that was something that, whilst that movement was taking place, that you were consciously aware of, that like people in the far right of this country were using the Yellow Vest as a cause and turning it almost into like an anti-immigration, racially charged movement. And as an extension to that, do you think that there was almost like a deliberate tactic from the French establishment to try and masquerade your movement as something quite different internationally to what it was domestically in France?
Well, actually, it was also domestically that he used these tactics. At first, they said the violence came from they have the ultra-right, which is ultra-droite. They said the Gilets jaunes movement was the stage of ultra-droite violence. And basically that most of the Gilets, because you had far-right activists in the Gilets jaunes, but they try to say the Gilets jaunes is mostly a far-right movement. This is what was in the media, and on the first days you had some racist acts. But let's say you had 2,000 demonstration points, and in some points you actually had some racist acts. You could see like videos of a black woman being abused by demonstrators. In Calais, like the fascists posing at Gilets jaunes denounced migrants. And this was used to say that the movement was a far-right movement. And actually very quickly, they turned to the other tactic, is that the Gilets jaunes were not a far-right movement, they were an ultra-left movement, which was a Zadist black bloc rioting movement. And there was the emergence of a new violent group, which was the ultra-yellow, the ultra-jaune. So basically, it's a governmental tactic trying to portray the movement as, an extremist figure. They tried it with the right, and then when it didn't work, tried it with the left. But actually, this is one thing. This is the discourse in the media, and the other thing is that there was actually a presence of the far right in the movement, and the images you've seen, of the policemen at the Arch of Triumph being kicked by the demonstrator is actually the Bastion Social group, who were like 80 activists who just beat up the police at that point. So they were there. They left, but they were there. Yeah.
So, what do you think inoculated the movement from the far right? What prevented them from really getting a foothold? I mean, you went through it in terms of why the far right activists maybe didn't gel with the demands of the movement, but what happened sort of from the other point of view? Like, why were people showing up to the various occupation points as part of the movement, kind of, if not resistant, but just not that interested in what far right activists had to say?
I think one thing was that the media were saying the Gilets jaunes are far right. And so if people were far right saying, hey, we should be far right, lots of people did not want to be associated with that. That's one thing. And I think the other thing is just that most of people did not share these far right ideas. Yeah. And even the funny thing is, even the people who were like not active, like activists, but were probably like voting on the National Front, like they've changed. And for instance, there's this woman in Montpellier, which is quite influential on the social media. At the beginning of the movement, she was calling for a military, what do you call that, putsch? Military takeover of France and establishment of dictatorship. And then there were like campaigns on the far right saying the anti-fascists were trying to take over the movement, and she was posting things: beware of the Antifa, they hide out between you, beware of the anti-fascists. And nowadays, she's still in the movement, and she's like, we should vote for Mélenchon, we're anti-racist, we're against the police violence. So I think there's been lots of people who were kind of part of the far right, were not like really like activists, but were interested in the far right, were actually meeting people. And also the thing is the Gilets jaunes was not, the banlieue were not massively inside of the Gilets jaunes, but it was also ethnically diverse. And there were never like attempts to throw out people who were Gilets jaunes and who were black or of Arabic descent. You have lots of Gitans, which is the gypsies, I don't know why, but they engaged massively also inside of the Gilets jaunes. So it's maybe this diversity also of the movement that might explain that. But
I think another answer maybe, I think what was so successful in that movement is that it was a crystallization of all this opposition that people felt against like Parisian politics, right? The fact that so much of the discourse you see in the media and the kind of concerns that that government has relates to Parisian life or big metropolis lives, and there's like this strong sense that the rest of the country is often forgotten by politics, kind of similarly to here between London and the north. And so this was something that was just so threatening to people who didn't live in big cities where you wouldn't use your car, you would just use public transportation, that it became a common ground, right? I think that's why people showed up a lot. They weren't really, it wasn't a political thing at the beginning, right? It was just like, how am I going to drive to work? You know, I need food on my table and I need petrol in my car so that I can feed my kids. You know. So do you
No, it's okay. Go finish your sentence.
do you see political instrumentalization of the movement today? I've seen Mélenchon do it a bit, but he will only do that. But like because we have local elections in France coming up. They're mostly talking about pensions. Are they actually kind of trying to pick back that as a way to get people to vote for them, the kind of yellow vest concerns or demands? Or is that being kind of forgotten in politics?
Depends. Basically, like the yellow vest, there are trials to have like European election lists. Every electoral attempt of having like a yellow vest list was utter failure, and people actually tried that where they were insulted, they were threatened, and they had to throw like just to stop. So that's one thing, but the other thing is now the France Insoumise, which is the left. They try to support citizens, direct democracy lists, which kind of stem from the Gilets jaunes refusal of representation and etc. So that's one part of it, but it's not directly stemming from the Gilets jaunes, I think.
Or was it just because you didn't have enough time? Like that was an important part of the movement too. But it wasn't just rioting in the streets, it was also about organizing on a long term and even building dual power.
Well, the reason I didn't talk very much about it is at first I didn't have time because, of course, there are things to be said, but I don't think the assemblies, even though the assemblies represent a part of the movement, a part of the left of the movement, but they were never the heart of the movement. The assemblies, we hosted them in Montpellier, because I come from Montpellier, and actually most of the Gilets jaunes in Montpellier, they boycotted the assemblies. Not in Montpellier, but even around the assemblies. So you had lots of groups which are quite on the left, and you have maybe 400 groups coming to the assemblies. But they're not representative of, like, for instance, the same thing in Toulouse. There's one group who sent a delegation, but you have 4 or 5 different Gilets jaunes groups in Toulouse, and all around Toulouse it's the same thing. So the Commercy Assembly were really, how do you say, the meeting place of part of the movement, I think. And also they were not really decisive, they were not places where actually things were really decided from day to day because they're like a couple of months apart. So it's like more of a, how do you say, a place where people gathered and an actual coordination of the movement as a whole, I think.
So I'm just really intrigued by that coordination element because and how it relates to like social media theory, which I know nothing about. Because it's very distributed. It sounds like a very distributed way of, but not even necessarily that distributed if you have these individual kind of influences. So how are things like we're going to do these demonstrations now, or it's going to happen on Saturday? Did these things emerge organically? Did they emerge, like how did it happen? Has anyone really looked in detail at how it happened and sort of modeled
I guess the way it happened is like viral communication, basically. Is let's say you have one person who says, let's meet at 10, let's meet there, one person who says, let's meet there, and actually you've got all those calls for action, and some call actually materialize, and quite soon these calls became ritualized also. And for instance, in Toulouse, there were demonstration every Saturday at 2 o'clock. People would gather there, and after that, if people were dispersed and if the demonstration was pretty much disbanded by the police, there will be the same gathering point which people will use all the time, basically. So very quickly you had like traditions that emerged, and I think also this, when it stopped from being viral to being traditional, it also lost the ability to surprise the French state, which hindered the efficiency of the movement as well. But I think, yeah, it's pretty much people proposing things and some things actually gathering enough momentum to have a lot of people, and the rest not, I think.
There are elements that are similar to the uprisings in Sudan.
Where?
They're in Sudan.
Yeah.
I have a family from my dad's side is from Sudan. I think there are elements of that kind of viral communication thing, but I think the difference was in Sudan there was a lot more, there was probably more leadership in the sense that it was the same groups of like students or union individuals who would have been protesting for years and kind of keeping the active protest alive. So it's not traditional leadership, but the continuity almost was still there. There were people who were like at the forefront.
But so,
I was just saying, can I just ask you, because you mentioned it wasn't a trade union movement, what was the trade union perspective on this? Because you could make an argument that this is almost a big threat to their legitimacy, because this would be a movement that would have numbers greater than a lot of the French trade unions could generate through a strike. So what was their kind of perspective on that? Were they friendly, or perhaps a bit more, not hostile, but intimidated by the support you had?
Well, actually, most of the basically the French trade unions, it's not like here, you got several trade unions. Half of the French trade unions actually do not strike, they do not demonstrate, etc. There's only 4 trade unions who actually like do something, which is Force Ouvrière, CGT, FSU, and Solidaire. And actually, for instance, the CGT, they did not want as a confederacy to take part of that, but you had some local sections, because the CGT is also, it's a bureaucratic organization, but it's also a chaotic organization. You had some sections who were actually very active in the movement, and for instance in Martigues, which is an industrial town in the south of France, the Gilets jaunes was organized by the CGT. So that was part of it. Also the Union Solidaire, which is pretty much the left-wing union, which was, after 2 weeks, they completely went into the movement, and they organized themselves with the means they had to the movement. But on the whole, and this was kind of a thing that showed the line of divide, is after the violence of the 1st December, the government asked the union to sign a document saying they did not support the violence of the demonstrators, and that they were on the side of order, basically. And all of the trade unions, the one who do not strike and the one who strike, they signed that document, except for Solidaire, and the CGT signed that document, but there was very strong contestation, there was very strong people who opposed that, and they had a second declaration which was not exactly the same after signing that. So it's an ambivalence, I guess.
Well, what was the influence of these influences? Were they solely like messengers, or were any of them like instigators or any of these like demonstrations? You talk about like social media.
Yeah.
Were they just like messengers, or were they just commenting on the movement, or were they also some of the instigators, like in charge of starting, I don't know, meetups or like demonstrations?
Yeah. I think they were a bit of both. I think they were wanting to be leaders, And for instance, I think the yellow vest thing was Éric Drouet, who actually proposed that. And he was also the manager of the France en Colère groups, which gave way to the Gilets jaunes. But they actually never managed to materialize the influence on social media in effective leadership. But they kind of tried, because they created their groups, Gilets jaunes, with this person, but they never actually managed to have an organization around these leaderships, which was effective. So they remain on the side for lack of ability to become actual leaders, actually. And the thing is, with social media, as soon as someone came to prominence, you would have massive comments and massive insults and death threats to all the people who actually were saying, I'm the leader of the Gilets jaunes. So this is something else also, yeah.
Is there anything you don't understand about the movement? No.
Yes.
From social movement theory, there are so many things you can't explain, and I'm always keen on understanding what other people don't understand.
Well, I think the description of the movement is quite accurate, but why did such communication around symbols, claims, and social media became so massive in a short span of time, and how these people actually managed to be there on the streets so quickly, even though you can describe how it went. I'm not sure of what reasons made that these claims were possible and actually led people of being there. That's one first question. And the second question is the first stage of the movement really seemed like populist, bit right-wing. And it turned quickly, but how quickly it turned actually is something that, even though you can describe some factors, I'm not sure we really have explaining factors. That would be the two things that I think remain to be explained, and which, to my opinion, are quite a mystery as well. Yeah.
As far as the reason why it's difficult to explain it, because a lot of that communication isn't necessarily public. It's through that viral process that you can't actually. It's not just the tweets. It's not just the Facebook posts. It's all the WhatsApp groups. It's all the local contacts.
Yeah.
Good then. Thank you very much for staying so long, and Matthijs for coming.
Yeah, thank you for all these questions. And let's hope the strike is successful as well.
Cool. Thank you.